In this video, I'm going to show you how to make the Feeling Loopy top. This is from my pattern, the Feeling Loopy pattern, which comes with a dress view, a top view, and a mini crop top view. This video is just for the top view. So don't be alarmed if you're skipping steps, because the steps in the video correspond directly to the instruction booklet, and the instruction booklet takes you through all the views. So you'll be skipping certain steps in this video, so it might go from step like 12 to step 18, but that's just because you're skipping the dress view steps that you don't need to do for the top. So don't be alarmed if you're going from step 12 to step 18. It's correct, you're following the right video for the top view. Besides that, you'll also see that there's multiple choices within the video. So you will have two options for seam finishes, and I'm just going to show you one, but I'll pop up the illustrations from the instruction booklet for both options so that you can have a visual reference of the two different options that you could use for the seam finish. The reason for this is one of my goals with Forest and Thread was to teach people to make really high-end garments. Seam finishes are what takes a garment from being kind of like a basic level to a really high-end level. Feel free to ignore any seam finishes you don't want to do and just use an overlock or zigzag stitch to finish your raw edges, or go ahead and practice your skills and learn something new and try the bias binding or the French seam, and it'll be there in the video and you can ignore it if you want to. It's totally up to you. Throughout the video, I'll be referencing those higher end seam finishes that I'm talking about. I made separate videos for each of the seam finishes. So there's a separate video for a French seam, how to make continuous bias tape, how to sew a bias binding around a seam, and there's even another video for how to gather. If you're someone who hasn't really had much experience with gathering, then I have a separate video for all of those details. They will all be linked, they'll all be available on my channel, and that way you can just pull up those videos in a separate tab and you can just bounce back and forth throughout the video so that you can watch them as many times as you need, and you can even reference them when you're doing another project. I kind of like the idea of creating a stitch library for you, so you have like a resource guide of all the types of seam finishes that I teach you in my patterns. And so my YouTube channel, I'll just keep building this resource library of different seam finishing techniques. This is kind of like my first stab at doing that. So let me know what you think of that. In addition to the different views that the pattern comes with, the pattern comes with multiple options. So you have the option between narrow straps or wide straps, and you have the option between back ties or an invisible zipper. All of the options are included in the video, and so you'll see a banner at the top of the video that will say back ties option or invisible zipper option, or wide straps option, or narrow straps option. Just follow the ones that apply to the options you're choosing to make. You can jump ahead by following the timestamps in the caption below the video or in the bar below where there's little dots, and you can skip ahead to the options that you're working on. So in this video specifically, I'm working on a Feeling Loopy top that has the narrow straps with the back ties. I'm going to insert some of the video from me making the dress view with the invisible zipper and the wide strap ties, just so that you have a visual reference, but don't be confused when you see a few videos that might look different. Those are from the dress view, but they're applicable to the top view that you're working on in this video. Okay, so I think that's it for the intro, and I love this pattern. I hope you love it, and I hope you enjoy making it, and let me know what you think of the video. Thanks so much. Bye. For the Feeling Loopy top, you're going to need the following materials: your self fabric or your main fabric. It's best to use a lightweight to midweight woven material. If it doesn't have a lot of natural give to it, make sure to choose your size accordingly. You'll need your lightweight fusible interfacing. This is just for the bodice pieces and the wide strap ties if you're choosing to use the wide strap ties. You'll need matching thread to your fabric. An optional step is adding foam bra cups within the bodice outer layer and the bodice lining. Foam bra cups are available in various sizes, so order one according to your personal sizing. This is optional depending on your closure choice. You can use a hook and eye at the top of your invisible zipper. An invisible zipper is needed if you're going to be using that back closure choice. Prepare your pattern for your chosen view and chosen size. I like to use a notch cutter to cut out the notches along the edges of the pattern. This makes it easier for marking your fabric. I also like to use a screw punch, which is a really handy tool for marking areas within the pattern. I'm going to use it for the dart point. Prepare your fabric. You should wash and dry your fabric according to how you will wash and dry your garment, and then press your fabric. Cut out your fabric according to the size, layout, and view that you are making. Cut out your inner facing. If you are making the wide strap tie version, then you're going to want to cut out interfacing of your wide strap tie pattern piece. If you're using a thicker fabric, you may be able to skip this step. I just like how it reinforces a lighter weight fabric for keeping the straps nice and neat. Mark your notches. Make sure to mark the center front notch on any pattern pieces that are cut on the fold. Apply your fusible interfacing. Using the appropriate iron setting for your fabric choice, lay your front bodice fabric face down and your matching interfacing piece glue side down on top. Press slowly and carefully over the interfacing until it adheres to the fabric. I like to lift up my iron and spot press it first to make sure you don't stretch the interfacing as you move the iron. Repeat this method for your back bodice pieces, and repeat it again for your bottom bodice band pieces. If you are using the wide strap ties, repeat this method for all 4 of these pieces as well. If you are making a version with the back ties option, then you're going to need bias tape. I like to go ahead and make continuous bias tape at the beginning of my sewing project so that I can just wrap it around a scrap piece of cardboard or paper and set it aside for later when I need it within the sewing construction steps. You can check out my other video for how to make continuous bias tape. Fold your narrow straps and back ties in half lengthwise with right sides together, and pin in place along the raw edges. Sew your narrow straps and back ties along the raw edges using a 1/4 inch or 6 mm seam allowance. If needed, due to stiffer fabrics, trim your excess seam allowance down to 1/8 inch or 3 mm. Using either a super tiny safety pin or a loop turner, which I'm using here, turn your narrow straps and back ties right side out. Press your narrow straps and back ties flat with the seam directly on the edge. Repeat these steps for all 6 pieces and set aside for later. Fold your wide strap ties in half lengthwise with right sides together and pin along the long edges. Sew along the length of your wide strap ties using 1/2 inch or 13 mm seam allowance. Pivot your needle at the corner and sew along the short edge of your wide strap ties using 1/2 inch or 13 mm seam allowance. Trim your seam allowance down to 1/4 inch along that short edge. Trim your corner at a 45-degree angle in order to make a nice crisp corner. Turn your wide strap ties right side out. I like to use a bobby pin to push the sewn short edge down into the tubular tie. You can also use a knitting needle or a chopstick to do this as well. Use the bobby pin end to push out the finished corners, hold the tie vertical with the open end at the bottom and let the bobby pin drop out. Press your seam directly on the edge. Repeat this for all 4 ties and set aside for later. Transfer the dart point onto the wrong side of your front bodice pieces. You may also want to transfer the dart legs to help guide you as you sew. The seam allowance here is 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. With right sides facing, pin the dart edges together. Sew with 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance from the dart opening to the point. I'm adding a pin to the very point, and then I'm going to slightly curve my dart legs so that it helps to avoid any pointy dart situation. You may also find it helpful to read the additional tips in the sewing instructions for how to avoid pointy darts. Leave your threads long and then tie a double knot at the dart tip. And then trim your threads. Using a tailor's ham or a rolled up towel to create a curved surface safe for ironing, press the seam allowance down along the dart. Make sure the dart point is being gently pressed into a curved shape. It's good to pull the dart point nice and taut. With right sides facing, pin your front bodice and back bodice together along the side edges. Match the interfaced front bodice with the interfaced back bodice. Make sure the single notches are on the top and the double notches are on the bottom edge to ensure the correct orientation of both pieces. The back bodice doesn't have any notches along the side edge. Sew together with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Grade your seam allowance. And press your seam allowance away from the front bodice. Pin one narrow strap to each of the notches on the top edge of your interfaced back bodice pieces. Make sure to pin them to the right side of your back bodice, with the strap coming down away from the top edge. Sew with 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Bring the other end of each strap to the notches on the top edge of your interfaced front bodice piece. Be careful not to twist the strap. Make sure to pin them to the right side of the front bodice with the strap coming down away from the top edge. You may want to do a quick fitting here and double check that the strap length is correct for your personal preference. Trim the strap length accordingly. Sew with 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Pin the remaining back ties to each of the notches along the center back edge on the interfaced back bodice pieces. You want 2 straps attached to each side so that you can tie them closed while wearing. Make sure to pin them to the right side of the back bodice with the straps coming away from the side edge. Sew with 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. For extra strength and security, you may wish to add a little scrap of interfacing over each end of the narrow straps and back ties, where you've attached them to the bodice. Cut 8 little rectangle pieces approximately 1 inch by 3/8 of an inch, or 2.5 centimeters by 1 centimeter in size. Adhere the fusible interfacing to the right side of the garment, directly over where you have attached the straps, within the seam allowance, which is 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters. Pin the short raw edge of the wide strap tie to each of the notches on the top edge of your interfaced front bodice and back bodice piece. Make sure to pin them to the face side of the bodice pieces with the straps coming down away from the top edge. Center the wide strap ties directly over the notches. You may want to do a quick fitting here and double check the strap placement along the top edge. The wide strap ties are intended to cover a bra strap. If you plan to wear this garment with a bra, try on the bodice piece over your bra and adjust the strap placement accordingly. Sew with a 1/4 inch or 6 mm seam allowance. Sew your front skirt and back skirt together along the short side edges with option 1 or 2. Option 1 is to sew with a French seam. Option 2 is to sew a regular seam and then finish your seam allowance with an overlock or zigzag stitch. I'm going to be doing a French seam. You can see my more detailed stitch instruction video for how to sew a French seam. After completing your seam, press the seam allowance towards the back skirt. Prepare your side skirt panel for gathering. Sewing with a basting stitch length of approximately 4 to 5 millimeters, sew along the top edge of your side skirt panel just between the double notch indicating the back and the furthest away single notch indicating the front. Use a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Leave your threads extra long at the beginning and end. Sew with a 5/8 inch or 60 millimeter seam allowance as well. Gather your piece until the top curved edge between the notches matches the length between the corresponding notches on the front skirt and back skirt pieces. Follow my other video for more specifics on how to gather. With right sides facing, pin your front skirt and back skirt semicircle cutout together with the side skirt panel curved gathered edge. You will need to stretch the semicircle cutout to match the curved gathered edge. Match the single notches indicating the front. Match the center single notch on the side skirt panel with the side seam on your front skirt and back skirt semicircle cutout. Match the double notches indicating the back and pin together all the way around. Circular edges means that the majority of the raw edge is on the bias. What does that have to do with anything? Well, cutting woven fabrics on the bias allows extra stretch. So don't be afraid to stretch that semicircle cutout to match the edges of the side skirt panel. Set your stitch length back to a regular amount of approximately 2.5 or 3 millimeters, and sew along your pinned edge with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. You should be sewing in between your 2 basting stitch lines, where the gathering is located. Keep your basting stitches intact for now. Choose how you would like to finish your seam allowance with option 1 or 2. Option 1 is to finish with an overlock or zigzag stitch, and then press the seam up away from the side skirt panel. Option 2 is to use a bias binding, which is what you're seeing here. I have another video to show you how to sew a bias binding on this seam. After finishing the bias binding, press the seam up away from the side skirt panel. Remove the basting stitches with a seam ripper or thread scissors. The following steps are just for the back ties option. Finish the center back edge of your back skirt with option 1 or 2. Option 1 is to use an overlock or zigzag stitch. Option 2 is what I'm showing here. Fold the center back edge under a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters towards the wrong side of your fabric. Press. Fold another 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters under along the same edge to completely enclose the raw edge. Press again. Sew an edge stitch. With right sides facing, pin the back skirt pieces together along the center back edge, from the hem up until the notch. Sew together just inside of the finished center back edges. Press your seam allowances open. The following steps are just for the invisible zipper option. Trim away 1/4 inch or 6 mm seam allowance from the center back edge. Ignore the fusible interfacing that you're seeing there. I changed it to add it after trimming away the edge. Apply a 5/8 inch or 60 mm strip of interfacing to the wrong side of your back skirt pieces along the center back edges, just 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters past the notch. Finish each center back edge separately with an overlock or zigzag stitch. With right sides facing, pin the back skirt pieces along the center back edge from the hem up until the notch. Sew together with 1/2 inch seam allowance, just from the notch down to the hem. Press your seam allowance open. Sewing with a basting stitch length of approximately 4 to 5 mm, stitch along the top edge of your front skirt and back skirt with 3/8 inch or 1 cm seam allowance, as well as 5/8 inch or 60 mm seam allowance. Sew the front skirt and each of the back skirt pieces top edge separately to make the gathering easier. Leave your beginning and ending threads extra long. Gather your piece until the top edge measures equal length to the bottom edge of your front bodice and back bodice pieces. Make sure your side seams line up as well as center back edges and center front notches. For more instructions, see my other video for how to gather. Bring your interfaced front bodice and back bodice pieces right sides together with the gathered front skirt and back skirt pieces. Match the bottom edge of your bodice to the top gathered edge of your skirt. Pin in place, matching side seams and center front notches along the way. For the center back ties option, the center back edges of your back bodice should hang over the back skirt center back edges by 1/2 inch or 13 mm. For the invisible zipper option, the center back edges should match. Set your stitch length back to a regular amount of approximately 2.5 or 3 mm, and sew along your pinned edge with 1/2 inch or 13 mm seam allowance. You should be sewing in between your 2 basting stitch lines. Remove the basting stitches with a seam ripper and thread scissors. With right sides facing, pin together 2 mirrored bottom bodice band pieces along the center front middle notched edge. Make sure to match the interfaced bottom bodice band pieces together. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13 mm seam allowance. Press your seam allowances open. If you're doing the back ties option, continue on to the next step. For the invisible zipper option, finish the bottom edge of your bottom bodice band pieces with option 1 or 2. The bottom edge has no notches along it. I'm going to show you option 2. Fold under 1/2 inch or 13 mm seam allowance and press in place. Bring the right side of your interfaced bottom bodice band piece to the wrong side of your assembled garment along the bodice seam line. Match the top notched edge of your bottom bodice band to the bottom layer of your bodice seam. The bottom layer should be sandwiched in between the bottom bodice band and the front bodice and back bodice pieces. Pin together matching notches along the way. Match the side seam notch on your bottom bodice band to the side seam on your front bodice and back bodice. Match the center front seam on your bottom bodice band to the center front notch on your front bodice. The center back edges should remain folded under for the back ties option. The center back edges should be unfolded and match for the invisible zipper option. Sew along this pinned edge through all the layers using 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Sew with your bodice pieces facing up so you can use the previously sewn stitch line as your guide. Grade your seam allowances. Press your seam allowance up towards the front bodice and back bodice. With right sides facing, bring together the remaining front bodice and back bodice pieces to the remaining bottom bodice band pieces. Match the top notched edge of your bottom bodice band piece to the bottom edge of your front bodice and back bodice pieces. Pin together, matching notches along the way. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Grade your seam allowances. Press your seam allowance down towards the bottom bodice band. This piece will now be referred to as your bodice lining. Your inner faced front bodice and back bodice will now be referred to as your outer bodice piece. Trim off 1/8 of an inch or 3mm from the top edge of your bodice lining. This will help keep the bodice lining layer hidden within the outer bodice layer. The following steps are just for an invisible zipper closure. Align the center back edges of your interfaced bottom bodice band with the center back edges of your bottom layer. Pin in place. If you chose to finish the bottom edge of your bottom bodice band by folding under 1/2 inch or 13mm, make sure to keep the edge folded under as you sew. Sew a straight stitch to secure the two layers together. Prepare your invisible zipper by pressing the teeth flat. Use a lower heat setting designated for synthetic materials. You do not want to melt your zipper teeth. Place your zipper face down and glide your iron over the teeth, gently pushing the teeth away from your zipper tape. With the zipper face down, pin the zipper tape to the right side of your garment along the center back edge, starting at the top edge of your back bodice down to the notch. Line up the top edge of your zipper in fabric. Align the zipper teeth to be 1/2 inch or 13mm away from the edge of your fabric. I'm aligning the very top of the zipper teeth 1/2 inch or 13mm away from the top edge as well. Pin your zipper teeth to be open. Use an invisible zipper foot if you have one. This is what it looks like. You could also use a regular zipper foot and move your needle position to line up with the groove of the zipper teeth. Sew your zipper in place from the top edge down to the notch. Close your zipper and mark the bodice seam placement on the opposite side of your zipper tape with chalk or your preferred marking tool. Unzip your zipper and then make sure to twist and flip your zipper to be face down. Pin your zipper teeth open on the second side, matching the mark you've made with the bodice seam along the way. It's easiest to start with that mark. Line up your zipper teeth 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters away from the center back edge. Pin from the top edge down to the notch. Sew using an invisible zipper foot if you have one, or use your regular zipper foot and move your needle position to line up with the groove of your zipper teeth. Sew from the top edge down to the notch. Push your zipper pull up through the opening and zip it closed. Your bodice seam should line up. Give your closed zipper a little press. It might be helpful to use a tailor's ham. With right sides facing, bring your bodice lining to your outer bodice piece along the top edge. Match the center back edges, side seams, and center front notches. The invisible zipper tape should be facing up and sandwiched in between the two layers. Pin along the top edge. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Grade your seam allowances. Press the seam allowance towards the bodice lining. I find it helpful to use a tailor's ham. Sew an understitch along the stitch line on the bodice lining side, making sure to catch the seam allowance underneath. Fold the bodice lining back towards the outer bodice with right sides facing. Pin along the center back edge. Make sure the center back edge of the outer bodice is unfolded with the zipper tape facing up and sandwiched in between the two layers. If you chose to fold the bottom edge of the bottom bodice band pieces, make sure to keep those edges folded, pinned together. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance just inside of the zipper teeth. Since I don't have a regular zipper foot for the sewing machine, I'm sewing as close as I can to the zipper teeth, which is closer to 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters, but that should be fine since it's just the lining piece. Fold your upper corner neatly and then turn your piece right side out. If you're using stiffer fabric, you may wish to trim the corner. Press your seams to be directly on the edge, slightly rolling inwards along the top edge due to the understitch. You may wish to add top stitching to the top edge of the bodice to help keep everything in place and to add extra strength to your straps. The following steps are just for the back ties option. With right sides facing, bring your bodice lining to your outer bodice piece along the top edge. Match the center back edges, side seams, and center front notches. Make sure the straps are sandwiched in between the layers and not twisted. The center back ties should be sandwiched in between the layers as well. Pin along the top edge, matching notches along the way. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Grade your seam allowances. Press the seam allowance towards the bodice lining. I find it helpful to use a tailor's ham. Sew an understitch along the stitch line on the bodice lining side, making sure to catch the seam allowance underneath. Fold the bodice lining back towards the outer bodice with right sides facing. The bottom layer should not be caught in this center back seam, rather just outside of it so it can hang freely. Make sure the center back ties are sandwiched in between the layers. Pin the center back edges together, matching the bodice seam. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Fold your upper corner neatly and then turn your piece right side out. You may wish to trim your corners if you are using a stiff fabric. Press your seams to be directly on the edges, slightly rolling inwards along the top edge due to the understitch. You may wish to add top stitching to the top edge of the bodice to help keep everything in place and to add extra strength to your straps. This is an optional step for adding foam bra cups. If you wish to add foam bra cups, try on your garment now and slip the bra cups in between the outer bodice and the bodice lining layers. Place the bra cups accordingly for your own personal preference. Pin them in place while fitting. Here I'm just loosely placing them and pinning them in place from the outside of the outer bodice, so that when I put it on for fitting, I have the pins and the bra cups already there. Okay, let's go fit this. After removing the garment, double check the placement feels relatively symmetrical to the center front, and then move the pins to the right side of the bodice lining layer only. I'm specifically pinning around the dart area and the bodice seam area. As well as one pin at the top underneath the strap. Stitch in the ditch, only sewing through the bodice lining and the foam bra cup. Sew along the dart seam to secure the foam bra cup in place. Sew along the bodice seam as well. You may wish to add a small stitch line at the top of the bra cup directly underneath the strap placement as well. The following step is just for the invisible zipper option. Pin the outer bodice and bodice lining layers together along the bottom edge, which is the bottom edge of your bottom bodice band pieces. Finish the bottom edge with option 1 or 2. Option 1 is to sew an edge stitch along the bottom edge. This is best used if you finished the bottom edge of your bottom bodice band pieces with an overlock or zigzag stitch. Option 2 is to hand sew a ladder stitch along the bottom edge. This is best used if you folded under your bottom bodice band pieces. I'm going to show you option 2. To sew a ladder stitch, you're going to sew by hand. I threaded a needle with a double thread and tied a knot. I'm hiding the knot in between the folded up seam allowance. To sew a ladder stitch, grab a tiny little bit of fabric from either edge of the seam you're trying to close. Here I'm grabbing a tiny bit of fabric for each stitch from either folded edge of the seam allowance. Then you pull tight to make the seam invisible. Sew around the entirety of the bottom bodice band pieces. The following steps are just for the back ties option. Bring the outer bodice and bodice lining layers together along the bottom edge, which is the bottom edge of your bottom bodice band pieces. Measure 15 inches or 38 centimeters along your bias tape, and then begin pinning your bias tape right sides facing to the bottom edges of your bottom bodice band pieces. When you make it around the entire bottom edge, measure 15 inches or 38 centimeters again from the center back edge along the bias tape, and then trim your bias tape. Sew using 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Trim the bias tape that extends past the center back edge by 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. Continue trimming 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters off the seam allowance. Press the bias tape away from the bottom bodice band pieces. Flip your piece to be right side down. Fold your bias tape in 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters along the raw edges and press. Fold the very ends of your extra bias tape that continues past the center back edges under 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters for an easy finished edge as you sew. Fold your bias tape over your raw seam allowance, completely enclosing it with the bias tape, and press in place. Make sure to keep the 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters folded under. You may wish to pin your bias tape in place from the right side. Alternatively, you can use a basting stitch or you can use basting glue to secure your bias tape before sewing an edge stitch from the right side of the bodice lining. Sew an edge stitch along the bias tape, catching the folded bias tape on the underside of your piece. Continue stitching the additional length of bias tape past the center back edges by sewing an edge stitch to keep the bias tape neatly folded into a 1/4 inch or 6mm strings. Now is a good moment to try on your garment one last time before the final sewing step, which is hemming. Along the bottom hem of your garment, fold under a 1/4 inch or 6mm towards the wrong side of your fabric and press in place. Fold under a 1/4 inch or 6mm a second time around the same bottom edge to enclose the raw edge completely. Press in place again. Sew an edge stitch around the entirety of the hem of your garment. For the back ties option, finish the raw ends of your center back ties by pushing in a 1/2 inch or 13mm of fabric within the tubular end. I like to use the tip of my thread scissors to push in the raw edges of my fabric. You can either sew using an edge stitch or hand sew a ladder stitch to secure the ends in place. Here I'm hand sewing a ladder stitch. Or you can sew an edge stitch. For the invisible zipper option, you can add a hook and eye to the center back top edge to make zipping up easier. Hand sew the hook and eye at the top corner edge on either side of your center back zipper.